Xenoblade Chronicles X is a super tactical mecha anime lolly waifu simulator, Rebirth XL Gold Platinum Edition E++, minus, plus simulator released in 2015 for the Wii U. Of course, the first thing that has to be said is holy shit, this game is huge. And huge games means huge reviews. Like, you may need to change your plans if you intend to watch all of this huge. I mean, you probably already knew that when you saw the length of this video, but I just thought I'd mention. Anyway, rather than waste more time, let's plunge right in. Since this is a sequel, and so I don't have to repeat those long-winded titles, I'll be referring to the original Xenoblade Chronicles as Chronicles, and Xenoblade Chronicles X as X. X is a JRPG loosely based on the Chronicles universe where the citizens of Earth are caught between the battles of two alien species and are forced to flee the Earth before its destruction. One ship of the Project Exodus is followed by an alien race known as the Prone and crash lands on the alien planet of Mira. After setting up their city of New Los Angeles, the human race endeavors to explore and study the planet of Mira and chiefly find and retrieve the Lifehold, a storage structure used to house a large percentage of humankind suspended in stasis for the interstellar journey. Your character, whom you can name and design however you see fit, although canonically is known as Cross, is awoken from a singular Lifehold unit and has a typical case of the old amnesia, knowing only your own name. Say what you will about the amnesia trope, but we all know it's an effective way to reveal story and gameplay elements to the player and character simultaneously. And in a game about exploration and discovery, it feels well suited. Why you get amnesia and literally nobody else, however, is a bit contrived, though not exactly damaging. Once escorted by Elma to NLA, you decide to join the not-so-voluntary service organization known as Blade, which allocates recruits based on their aptitudes in order to help establish the human race on Mira through different roles such as retrieving ship parts, placing probes, and slaying indigenous lifeforms that may be threatening to humankind. The rest of the game is pretty much your journey to become the baddest, assest Blade there ever was. Now that sounds vague, but it's what helps gives a sense of progression and purpose to just about anything you do in this game, because everything you can do in this game is in some way related to Blade's cause because Blade is so open-ended. Anything as simple to talking to some random NPC to killing an enormous tyrant all technically fall under the umbrella of advancing humanity's habitation on Mira. Even standing around and doing literally nothing is still technically progression since you'll be making money and gaining materials through your probes. The only thing you'll lose from doing nothing is the potential to be progressing faster, but I digress. In the fullness of time, you eventually do become the baddest ass in all of Blade, and it affects the people around you. NPCs you meet during later quests will recognize and respect you more and more as the game goes on. It's humbling to see your ambition and determination inspire others to follow in your footsteps through competition or admiration, even if they're just a bunch of computer programs. It helps make all the work you've put in feel worth it. Now, reclaiming the Lifehold is Blade's primary objective, but entwined in that is combating the alien force that attacked us in the first place and ideally resolving it diplomatically. So the story mainly revolves around your team unlocking all those mysteries and defending what may be humanity's last chance for survival. So the premise is fairly simple and not much more complicated than Chronicles, but once you begin to unveil the drapery of the situation, I think it's a much more engaging story. To clarify, I think Chronicles' story was overall better, but I find it way easier to relate with X's plight since you feel like you are your character, because you learn and experience everything along with him or her. Yes, you learned a lot of things with Shulk and the gang in Chronicles, but X just feels more rooted since it all falls within the discovery motif. Now, I don't want to spoil anything, even though the EU trailer spoiled major plot elements, but in Chronicles, the plot is, at first, avenging Fiora, a girl you barely get to know before she's killed. In X, the plot can be directly tied to your character in a way that feels personal, but also has consequences for everyone around you, and thus feels more compelling, in my opinion. I mean, the first 4 chapters just revolve around you trying to help out and figure things out, and then Chapter 5 hits you, and suddenly everything makes sense and helps propel you through the rest of the game. It's the kind of twist that I really like seeing, although it certainly drops the ball at the end with a lot of really nonsensical things going on that I can't really get into. Overall, the story isn't anything to write home about. I remember wondering how they could possibly make anything that could beat the significance and impossibly high stakes of Chronicles' ultimate climax. And it turns out they couldn't, so instead of retreading the same ground, they pulled back a bit and kept the story a bit more grounded, but still reasonably significant. As a whole, though, if you want to play X for its story, don't bother. Chronicles is better. And remember, that's coming from a guy who didn't really like it all that much in the first place. X's storytelling isn't as traditional as Chronicles. There's a larger focus on individual characters with the Affinity missions, and even those don't do a very great job most of the time. X's storytelling is at its best when it has to do with seemingly unimportant NPCs or small scenarios that are mostly independent of anything else. Helping out random citizens can many times lead to more interesting situations than whatever's currently happening on with the story or main characters. There's more to say about the story, but it also overlaps with a lot more things, so let's transition into something new. let's talk about how pretty this game is. Like, one of the things I really liked about Chronicles was how beautiful the environments were and how fun it was to explore the ins and outs and see all the sights and whatnot. So with X being an even bigger game, it's got even more of those jaw-dropping locales that just fills you to the breaking point with wonder and excitement. I just want to rub my face over everything I see, and knowing that with enough progression in the game that eventually I will rub my face over everything, it just makes me giddier than a schoolgirl. It's a good thing they didn't include the orange soapstone from Dark Souls in this game, because the entire planet would just be plastered with messages that read, amazing view, amazing view, amazing view, amazing chest, try rear. New LA is a pretty cool place too. Look, they even allow women to drive in the future.
Jeez.
Just like its predecessor, X may not be the most graphically intense game out there, but it more than makes up for it with how stunningly gorgeous each region looks. And it still looks pretty good graphically anyway. What helps elevate the environments is the progression in which you explore them. At first you're on foot, getting anywhere takes forever, and you'll be mashing your face up against cliffs trying to jump your way up them. Once you get your Skell, your movement speed is dramatically increased along with your jump height. Once you finally get your flight module, then and only then will everything be accessible to you, but more on that later. So the game is still nice looking. Is the music still as good? Well, yes and no. The tracks for each of the overworld regions are really great, some of the best in the game. There's really nothing quite like wandering in Oblivion and hearing this for the first time. And some battle themes, while they may seem odd at first with the vocals, can end up being fun to listen to as well. To avoid butchering names, composer for X was this guy who's done work for this stuff, and while there aren't really any tracks that are notably bad, Chronicles had way more memorable tracks and probably a better soundtrack overall. X still has a great soundtrack, better than a lot of games released this year, though it doesn't quite live up to Chronicles. It's still well worth a listen if you have the time though. So far it looks like Chronicles is winning with a better story and soundtrack, and if that's what you're looking for in a JRPG, I'll tell you right now to go for that one instead. But X has more than its good looks going for it. Let's ease our way into the gameplay with a look at the ground combat. You've got the same basic setup as Chronicles, a string of arts along the bottom of the screen, each with their own different types of effects that can be customized and combined to form combos, make buffs or debuffs, or do things like regenerate health or block certain types of damage. An added mechanic is the secondary and tertiary cooldowns to your arts. If you're willing to wait a bit longer to use an art, that art will become more effective. The tertiary cooldown is essentially the same thing, except even more effective and only accessible during overdrive. Overdrive is more or less the replacement to the chain attacks. Instead of a party meter, each member has their own tension meter. Now, tension existed in Chronicles, but it didn't have any visible bar and only had passive effects. Anyway, once you get 3000 TP, you can activate Overdrive, which causes all your arts to recharge incredibly fast and also allows for the tertiary cooldowns. Overdrive is a fairly interesting new mechanic, and it fits nicely with the story. If you're clever enough, you can exploit it to give yourself infinite overdrive, which is damn near necessary if you ever wanted to do anything post-game. For the most part, the game is balanced to give yourself a fairly challenging time through the game, but if you learn yourself to the game's mechanics and outfit yourself with the right gear, you can pretty much break the game. Though, to be fair, you'll have to progress quite a ways before you have the means to unlock these things, and again, it takes a certain breadth of knowledge and experimentation to figure it out unless you look it up online. All in all, it's different enough not to feel like a retread and gives X a bit more of its own identity while still feeling familiar, and still relatively simple enough for newcomers to pick up easily. There's definitely a ton you need to learn. The game is pretty good at teaching you all the basics, and you can always go into the manual if there's something you don't quite understand or you're looking to learn more about something. It may seem a bit obtuse to have to go into the manual to learn how some parts of a game work, but as big and complex a game as this is, it just seems more practical to keep it all in one place you can look into whenever you need to, rather than try to explain it all through text boxes and expecting you to remember. Customization is a bit different. You can rearrange and swap out your arts for yourself and your party members, but your character also has the ability to change classes, and in a way even combine classes to suit your own playstyle. Then of course you can upgrade your arts as you see fit. In Chronicles there were 7 playable characters, and thus 7 classes. In X there are 18.5 playable characters, and what ends up basically being only about 6 classes. But of course the added customization can add a lot of choices for your own character, and all the other playable characters always have 1 or 2 things that make them unique that you can eventually incorporate to yourself. One downside is that Cross, your character, cannot be removed. You can play as any of the other characters, but Cross cannot leave the party at any point in the game. It's not what I consider ideal, but at least you can customize him or her to be any class you want as long as you've trained them in it. Also, I think it was a missed opportunity that they didn't include more alien party members, considering how many you eventually befriend. Not really a problem, I just think it would have been really cool. It also would have helped if it was easier to raise affinity. With 18.5 members, it will take you quite a while to raise affinity with each one of them in order to do all their missions. Something similar to how they gain exponentially more experience when they're much lower level than you could have helped a lot. There just doesn't seem to be enough affinity awards in the missions to be able to raise them all up by the end. Since Elma and Lynn are your main party members and required for all story missions, you really only have one character slot to raise affinity and levels with another member. It's hard to kick either of them out between missions because you're going to want competently leveled party members for the entire story. Thankfully, all you have to worry about is their affinity with you rather than their affinity with each other, and the reward you get for completing their affinity missions may be well worth it. I mentioned that characters that are lower level than you receive bonus experience, but that may still mean that you have to grind their levels back up before every mission, which can be pretty tedious, especially if you run into a particularly hard mission. As before, X is basically a single-player MMO, and what you'll be doing for the most of the game is completing missions. There are 4 types of missions: Story, Affinity, Normal, and Basic. Story obviously has to do with the story, Affinity explores the characters you can have in your party, Normals are mini-stories with random citizens of Mira, and Basics are just your run-of-the-mill kill X of these or collect X of this missions with no kind of narrative. Story and Basic missions are fairly cut and dry, Affinity and Normal missions are where a lot of the fun can be found though. At the end of the day, all missions are kill this or collect these, but the short stories and dialogues with the characters are the main attraction for doing these missions, which help them all feel unique and gives you the drive to complete them. What's more is that most of the missions usually have some part in a much grander tale regarding a certain race of Xenos or organization. One of the major themes with these stories has to do with xenophobia and racism. Through your adventures you'll be collecting a wide variety of alien species to live with you in NLA, and naturally not everyone gets along with each other. I'd be remiss to call it a major theme since it's a fairly one-sided affair when almost all the xenophobes are radicals where the only solution ends up being to eliminate them. If it's trying to make some kind of political statement, it very utterly fails, especially when you walk onto the Manon ship and hear this little ditty. And I'm not trying to be political myself, I just find it hilarious. Anyway, apart from that, all the stories are pretty good, although none of them seem to paint any of the Xenos in a particularly favorable light. But maybe that's the point. Nopon are greedy, Manon are condescending pizza maniacs, Orphe are highly analytical and religious to themselves, lacking emotion, and the Zorobagan are, garbage men? All the basic missions can be accepted from this console here, but the story, normal, and infinity missions all have to be accepted on location. Most of these are in New LA, but you can also find a good few scattered all around Mira. What's good about this setup over Chronicles is that if you find a quest out in the wild, you know that it's a normal mission, and will have at least some kind of depth to it. Basic missions are all segregated to one area, and they don't count towards your overall completion, so you never feel pressured to do any of them unless you want the rewards. Hallelujah. Navigating any of the missions has been made a lot easier in X. You no longer have to memorize NPC locations or what time of day they appear, because it's all listed or marked out for you. I'm not sure why they removed the ability to switch the time of day on the fly to specific stations placed around the world, but there are very few instances where you may actually have to change the time of day, so it's not really a big deal. There are a few other types of missions available that are separate scenarios for different rewards, stuff like time attack and refighting bosses. But the real attraction is the online missions, which lets you team up with someone else to fight some enemies or even a special boss. These missions can often net you some valuable rewards, and if you combine that with the ways you can break the combat in your favor, it can lead some very effective ways to get better equipment if you put the time in. The online works well enough, but what really gets my gopher is what happens when you're disconnected or play offline. An obnoxious indication will make permanent residence on the upper left hand of the screen even during cutscenes. It's incredibly annoying, and I pity anyone who has to suffer through the entire game with that thing there for any number of reasons. The only way to reconnect is to quit to the title screen or sometimes close the game completely, which is also pretty annoying. The online aspects of the game can often make a lot of the tedious aspects of the game become more manageable, like when you want a specific monster drop. It's really punishing for someone who may not have an internet connection, and it makes me wonder just how much worse the game will become when the servers inevitably go offline in the future. That's its own discussion, though. Between all the missions and explorations, you've got this nifty tool called Frontier Nav, which is basically just the Wii U gamepad screen. Scattered across the planet are these beacons which you can plant a probe in, and all the treasures you can search through you can find specialized probes. The primary purpose of these probes is to mine resources and credits, the main resource being Miranium, which is used for unlocking armor and weapons along with other upgrades for them. It also has other uses like exchanging it for money or fuel. Frontier Nav almost acts like its own minigame in that you have to maximize your production and storage of resources by placing specific probes on certain spots and then chaining them together. It's surprisingly compulsive and enjoyable to work and rework your probe locations. Frontier Nav is also where you can access your fast travel and can indicate what objectives can be completed within a given hexagon. As a whole, I'd say it's diverse and useful enough to take advantage of the Wii U gamepad and give good enough reason for it to exist there. Of course, it wouldn't be a Xenoblade game without the Atomorphs, and so they're back in full force. I had some particularly unpleasant experiences with these in Chronicles, so much so that I still wince every time I hear the words ice cabbage. So I'm relieved to say that they've been handled much better in this game. Orbs respawn whenever you fast travel. They're all segregated to certain parts of the world so you can narrow down the area you need to search for a particular item. The drop rates don't seem nearly as rare. There are no areas that just disappear from the game completely, and the number of actual quests that require really rare orbs, or even orbs in general, are significantly lower. I never filled my Collectopedia in Chronicles, but in X I was able to fill it all in with almost no problem. They play a much smaller role and it makes them way less troublesome. So there's really not much to say about them other than that they've been significantly improved. Part of the reason item orbs exist is so that you have something to do while you run or drive around from place to place, but thankfully that's not all you can do. Each part of the world is packed with one thing or another, so it never feels like there's just a bunch of empty space. There's always orbs to collect, tyrants to kill, treasures to collect, sights to see, caves to explore, and all that fun stuff. And like I said, it's packed. How they managed to make such a massive world and make just about every bit of it interesting or memorable is just cool, alright? It's just cool. It's so hard to feel bored. You run through these awesome locations and you see these things in the distance that you want to explore but can't reach, and you just feel excited to go to all these places and see what's there and kill some giant monster or whatever. It's a true sense of exploration that I just haven't felt in many games before. I know that sounds cliche, but it seriously feels like you're actually exploring and discovering all these things for yourself, and it just feels great and it pushes you forward. For example, one of the first things you see in this game is this giant outcrop in the middle of the continent. And once you've explored enough, you realize that there's no way to get up there from the bottom. And after like 60 hours of game time, when you finally get your flight module and the first place that it tells you to go is the top of that giant structure, and you hop into the air for the first time, it's perfect, and it just feels great, like a whole nother dimension of the game just opens up. And hey, let's take this opportunity to talk about the Skells. I suppose they're what you call the main gimmick for this game, and they play a pretty big role, so there's just a little bit to say about them. Skells are kind of the first thing that gets dangled in front of your face and give you something to start working for at the beginning of the game. And when you get your first one, it's a pretty triumphant experience, but it almost feels like you're playing a completely different game once you unlock them. And that game is sometimes better, and other times worse. They enhance the exploration by helping you move faster and jump higher. With the added speed, it's a lot easier to run into enemies, but likewise it's a lot easier to run away. There's really not much reason to wander around without a Skell once you get one, because it really speeds things up for the better. The combat capability for the Skells is a bit more questionable. The Skell arts are tied to its weapons, and it has no secondary or tertiary cooldown, so it feels a lot simpler than ground combat. Overdrive is changed up in a way that I still don't fully understand it, but it doesn't seem possible to do any infinite overdrive to my knowledge. The Skells are incredibly powerful and have the highest damage outputs in the game, plus with their added mobility they can attack things over water and eventually in the air. The ground combat is just fleshed out more overall and also feels like a step down in combat with fighting in a Skell. It will finish a lot of fights a lot faster, and it's required to fight certain enemies, but it doesn't feel quite as good or complexly satisfying as the ground combat. For instance, I may have my Skell destroyed by a monster, but then I can brute force my way through the rest of the battle with careful management of my ground arts to keep myself healed and mitigating damage while also dealing out my own. The only limiting factor is that during combat and flight they consume fuel, but if you're putting any thought into your resource gathering, then it's almost a complete non-issue. They can also be destroyed, but it's not that hard to make your insurance last until the next Skell upgrade, so that's hardly a problem either. In general, Skells open up quite a bit of the game for you and feel one big step closer to taking on those giant creatures roaming about. But with all that sweetness, there's also a slight bitterness with the neutered combat. The true battle is picking out color combination and names for all the Skells you'll eventually get your hands on. Customizability is a pretty big part of X. You customize your character's looks even after the initial character creation, their voice, arts, your party, your Skell, and your fashion. Fashion gear is one of those things that I think almost every game that has numerous outfits should have and could benefit from. It allows you to change your appearance of any piece of gear to that of any other piece of gear while retaining the stats of what you actually have equipped. If you want to go through the entire game in a bikini, or there's just one particular set of armor you like more than all the others, you can wear it confidently. I can't tell you how many times I've intentionally neglected to wear an objectively superior piece of armor because it didn't match with the rest of my outfit, or I thought it just looked ugly. So if you like the standard clothing of a party member, you can have them keep on wearing it for the whole entire game while also boosting their stats with unseen armor. It's great, I love it, and while I'm no fashion diva, there have been many hours where I'll just be scrolling through my gear trying to make an outfit that I think looks nice before eventually giving up and leaving it the way that it was. It's a shame that a lot of the gear is either a recolor or a straight up duplicate, but at least that means you can make twinsies. This is my character, by the way. I chose to play as a girl, not because...
I like the idea of having strong female characters in the games,
but because she's cute. And I think it's funny seeing a ragtag harem of girls running around fighting with and in giant robots like the pure, God-fearing, red-blooded American of distinguished taste that I am. Sure, she looks like some sort of generic DeviantArt OC, but whatever, I'd snuggle with her. Don't picture it. Anyway, the character customization lets you play as and who you want, especially if you're a creep like me. But it's worth noting that because of all the voice options, your character doesn't have any voice lines in the story. You have little dialogue options that pop up, but your character's voice only comes into play during battle when you're shouting out your moves in soul voices. X got a proper Western localization, so all that British voice charm is gone, but you can still choose a couple of the original voice actors for your own character. But my point is that while you kind of lose that original sense of performance, the pre- and post-battle bants are still as entertaining as ever. It's always fun hearing the different conversations that pop up with the different mixture of party members.
Hey Alexa, when are you gonna get it up over something besides Skells?
Whatever. All you talk about is booze and your brother.
What's not so great is that a lot of the performances during voice scenes feel kind of wooden, and I wouldn't necessarily blame the actors for this. A lot of the timing between dialogues is always off by just a bit, and sometimes the music swells over the voices to the point where you can barely hear them. A lot of the cutscenes, or any voice scenes for that matter, just lack the proper flow to them, so they often feel clunky and awkward. I'd like to say that it's a result of the timing being optimized for Japanese performances rather than English, but mostly it feels like the scenes themselves are just oddly paced. Earlier I mentioned that the graphics weren't the best, and that's not to say that they're bad, quite the contrary, but the game is filled with quite a few graphical issues. It's hard to give fault given the sheer scope of the game, but the way the game obviously swaps out low and high res models and how long it takes to fully load up an area can be quite irritating. This happens mostly after fast travel, which makes sense, but it can't even catch up with the speeds you reach in a Skell. Even with the high-speed loading packs that practically require you to put on some kind of external storage, the game struggles to keep up. And with this slow loading, an issue that inevitably arises is pop-in, and it's particularly bad whenever you're traveling in a Skell. Obviously, it's unreasonable to expect to see everything when you're flying 1,000 feet in the air, but even when you're driving around, you may not be able to see enemies until you're right on top of them. Couple that with the fact that you might accidentally trample an enemy, and things can get particularly annoying. The world seems to load at a fast enough pace for ground travel, so it's just another way that the Skells can feel like they changed the game, since they just don't jive with the hardware limitations. It's obvious that the Skells were intended to be an integral aspect of the game, but it seems at almost every turn that they couldn't get them to work as well as they originally wanted, which is unfortunate. The Skells are still cool, and they can still be a lot of fun, but it's obvious that they didn't reach their full potential. On the bright side of things, the entire world is devoid of any loading screens save for entering your barracks, and you can walk from one end of the world all the way to the other from pretty much the very beginning. I know that's a big deal, and I kinda made it sound like a footnote, but that was one of the key marketing points of the game, so I don't really feel the need to harp on about it, other than to say that it's good, and it works. I feel like I shouldn't need to say this, but in all the hours I've spent playing this game, I've run into a grand total of 0 bugs or glitches. The only thing remotely close was this slightly unfinished rock here. For an open world game of this scope, that's really quite impressive. I don't think I should have to praise a game for working properly at launch, but lately games are often released with quite a few bugs still left in them. Now, shippable bugs is its own discussion topic, probably more suited for other people to talk about, but it's nice to see a game like this devoid of them. Well, it looks like we've finally reached the end of this review, sort of. We've gone through a lot, but it's just like before, there's still quite a bit more that I didn't cover. It really is a massive game, and it's hard to look at all of it and sum it up in one video, but hopefully you've got a pretty good idea by now. It seems like I've got a disproportionate amount of negative feedback as opposed to positive, but I can't deny the fact that I had an absolute blast playing this game all the way through to the end, and even a little bit beyond. There are a lot of things wrong with this game. It reminds me of my review of Chronicles, where all the little annoying things really got to me. But even though the problems this time around still bother me, they don't really bother me all that much. Now, that sounds hypocritical, and I know I should be more upset about a lot of them. But I was just always having a good time, and they never really got to me. The expanded gameplay, the large amounts of interesting and streamlined quests, the adventuresome and exploratory atmosphere all came together to entertain and distract me from most of the unsavory parts. There are many things Chronicles does better than X. It has a better story, better characters, and a better soundtrack. But in the end, I'd have to say that X is the better game. Despite what you may think, I respect Chronicles quite a bit, but I just had more enjoyable time playing X than I did with it. That said, I think it really diminishes in quality after the first time you've played it. Once you've been everywhere and seen everything, you're not going to feel the sense of exploration on repeat playthroughs. Even as big as a game it is, it gets smaller and smaller as you progress. Once you've cleared an area of things to do, there's not much reason to ever return. In the beginning of the game, everything you did felt like progression. But after the end, you really have to hone in on a certain objective, and that can result in the game feeling way more grind-intensive. So it's a game that is best experienced the first time through, with a lot of content to keep you busy. But once you start to wear that content thin, does the game start to lose its luster. All that said, it took about 170 hours for me to eventually decide to put the game down. It was well worth the price of admission, and the time I did have it with it was some of the best time I've ever had playing a game. A lot of people have different values when it comes to video games, especially those in the JRPG genre. And there are a notable amount of people who have opposite opinions when it comes to these two games and prefer Chronicles over X. Opposite is a surprisingly fitting word to sum up my feelings. I wanted to like Chronicles, but I didn't. and I wanted to dislike X, but I couldn't. And I'm honestly not trying to be contrarian or dense, but that's about the most accurately succinct way I can describe how I feel about these games, but I still enjoyed playing both. But as I said with Chronicles, it can really come down to player experiences and how you value each of the elements of the game, and you can hazard your expectations accordingly. But that's not going to stop me from recommending this game. I think it's a real gem.
You ever have that dream where you're inside one and it's just transforming over and over and over? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.